I remember it like it was yesterday, though in truth, it's been decades. I was 7, maybe 8, living in a quiet little town where the seasons seemed to move slowly, deliberately, like the heartbeat of the world itself. Summer mornings smelled of freshly cut grass, dew clinging stubbornly to the edges of the garden, and the air held the faintest hint of honeysuckle. It was in that garden, of all places, that my curiosity first took root. I had been watching my older cousins play with their toys, and I noticed, almost by accident, that I was drawn more to the delicate dolls than the rough-hewn action figures they wielded. There was something mesmerizing about the tiny clothes, the soft hair, the careful expressions frozen in porcelain faces. I couldn't explain why. I only knew it made me feel both calm and strange all at once, as if I had stumbled into a secret that belonged to someone else but somehow, quietly, belonged to me too. I never told anyone. My mother, busy with work and the household, noticed my reluctance to play outside as much as my brothers did, but she simply chalked it up to a quiet disposition. My father, stern and precise, never showed much patience for what he called silly pastimes. So I kept my fascination tucked into the corners of my room, hidden behind books, behind sketches, behind whispered stories I told myself in the dark. I learned to navigate my desire with the subtlety of a cat, curling my imagination around me like a blanket. And yet, there was a tension that always lingered, a faint pressure that maybe, just maybe, I was doing something wrong. That tension only grew when, one day, my mischief, my curiosity, really, led me to a punishment I couldn't have anticipated. I had sneaked into my sister's room, drawn by the faint smell of her perfumes and the soft rustle of fabric. I didn't take anything, not really, but I touched the delicate things, the ribbons, the dresses, the shoes neatly lined like soldiers on parade. And when she caught me, the shock on her face startled me more than her words. "Why are you playing with my things?" she asked, voice sharp but not cruel. I stammered, tried to explain, tried to hide, but nothing bridged the gap between what I felt and what she expected. The punishment was swift, though not violent. My parents decided, in that quiet, serious way only adults can, that I needed to learn responsibility and understand limits. And so, they gave me a task that seemed simple at first: to care for my sister's dolls for a week, to organize them, to dress them, to understand the care and patience it took to manage such delicate things. At first, I thought it was a punishment because it would be boring, tedious, a lesson in patience. But slowly, as the hours bled into days, I began to notice things I had never allowed myself to see before. The way the fabrics felt under my fingers, the gentle way a doll's hair could be combed without tangling, the small satisfaction in arranging the tiny shoes just so. And with each careful act, something inside me shifted. There was fear, yes, fear of being discovered, fear of being judged, fear of being too much of myself. But there was also a strange thrill, a tender sense of alignment I hadn't yet understood. In the stillness of those days, my own reflection in the mirror felt like a stranger I was slowly beginning to recognize. Days turned into weeks, and that week of punishment stretched in ways I could never have anticipated. I found myself waking early just to see the sunlight spill across the dolls' tiny faces, the morning light soft and forgiving. I would run my fingers along the lace of a dress, marvel at how delicate the stitching was, and quietly imagine the life of the little figure I held. It wasn't play in the way other children played. It was careful, reverent. And yet, with that reverence came a gnawing sense of shame I couldn't shake. I would look at my hands and wonder why the rest of the world couldn't see what I saw, that this attention, this care, was something deeply, beautifully mine, if only I could accept it. My family noticed the change, too, though they never said so out loud. My mother remarked that I had become more thoughtful. My father perhaps saw the quiet discipline forming in my routine. And yet, I could feel the unspoken questions, the unvoiced tension. Like a shadow, I could not escape. My older brother, who was always brash and quick to mock, would sometimes peek into the room and smirk, calling me names that left a sting I could barely describe. But even his teasing could not extinguish the small flame of fascination that was taking root. At night, I would sit by my window, watching the stars blink awake one by one, and wonder about the person I was becoming. I began to experiment quietly, trying on pieces of my sister's clothes in the privacy of my room. A scarf here, a ribbon there, just to see how it felt against my skin. My heart would pound with a mixture of fear and delight, my mind racing with questions I didn't yet have the courage to speak aloud. What was I doing? Was this wrong? Was it right? The silence of the night became my confidant, and in that silence, I discovered the first taste of freedom. It was a freedom that carried with it both wonder and weight, the knowledge that I was straying into a part of myself that the world might never accept. School brought its own challenges. I watched other boys with their rough games, their loud laughter, their uncomplicated sense of belonging. I envied them sometimes, wished I could be just like them. But the pull of who I was stronger, subtle yet persistent. I carried small tokens of my fascination in my backpack, tiny ribbons, scraps of fabric, a notebook filled with sketches of dresses I would never wear in public. It was a secret garden, carefully cultivated, and it made me feel alive in ways nothing else could. I learned early how to hide it, how to smile and nod, how to blend in, while also learning to nurture the quiet, tender part of myself that no one else could see. And yet, fear never fully left me. There were nights when I would lie awake, listening to the house settle in the dark, imagining what it would mean if someone discovered me. Would they laugh? Would they be angry? Would they love me at all? I realized then that acceptance, true acceptance, could not come from outside. It had to start within. It was a slow, deliberate process, as delicate as the lace I loved to trace, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Through it all, my relationship with my family deepened in unexpected ways. My mother began to notice my quiet diligence, my father the discipline that came with care, my sister sometimes left little notes for me, tiny, playful acknowledgments of my attention to her dolls. There were unspoken moments of connection that warmed me, moments when I felt understood without explanation, when the world's weight seemed just a little lighter. And yet the transformation, the psychological, emotional journey, was only beginning. I had glimpsed the edges of myself, the part that wanted to live fully in this tender space, and the journey toward that self would be long, winding, and quietly miraculous. By the time I was 10, the world around me seemed both larger and smaller at once. Larger, because I was beginning to sense that life extended beyond the small confines of my room, beyond the family garden, beyond the familiar streets of my neighborhood. Smaller, because I carried an inner universe that no one else could fully enter. A universe of colors, textures, and quiet truths that belonged entirely to me. I began to notice that every choice, every glance, every whisper of thought could feel magnified, amplified, and sometimes painfully scrutinized by my own self-consciousness. School remained a theater of comparison. I watched my classmates, some boasting loudly about sports victories, others about social dominance, and I could never seem to inhabit that space comfortably. I tried, sometimes, with varying degrees of success, to mimic their interests, to adopt the patterns expected of boys my age. But inside, my mind would drift to ribbons and lace, to the soft curve of a dress, to the patient, careful attention I could give to the dolls that had once seemed like punishment. That tension between conformity and the quiet pull of authenticity was exhausting, but it also began to shape me. I learned subtlety, discretion, the art of holding two worlds at once, one public, one private. Home became a sanctuary in its own imperfect way. My parents had their own routines, their own concerns, but in their steadiness, I found a rhythm that gave me courage. There were moments when my mother would leave her knitting near my room, a tacit invitation for me to touch it, to play with the textures. My father, never overtly expressive, would sometimes pause by the doorway, glance at my work on the dolls, and nod ever so slightly, a silent acknowledgement of my care and discipline. Even my sister, who had first discovered my curiosity in a burst of surprise and confusion, began to leave little surprises for me. A new ribbon, a scrap of fabric, a tiny accessory she thought I might appreciate. Each act, small though it seemed, became a secret bridge between us, connecting me to family in ways that words alone could not. And yet, the fear persisted. Fear of ridicule, of misunderstanding, of being too much or too strange for the world outside. There were nights I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if someday I would have to choose between hiding this part of myself or risking the fragile bonds I had with those I loved. I began writing quietly in a journal, a practice that became both refuge and revelation. I described the dolls, the textures, the sensations of wearing scarves or ribbons, but I also described my feelings, the shame, the joy, the longing, the terror. Reading those pages now, years later, I see the fingerprints of a self in discovery, of someone slowly learning that identity is not a single path, but a weaving of hidden streams, delicate and persistent. One day, my parents gave me a small, unexpected gift, a tiny mirror framed in soft pink wood. "For your desk," my mother said with a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes, "so you can see your work clearly." I remember feeling a rush of gratitude, mixed with guilt. The mirror became a sacred object. I would sit before it, dress the dolls, adjust the scarves, braid ribbons, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to see myself reflected. Not the reflection everyone else expected, not the boy the world demanded, but a version of me that was tender, patient, and authentic. Those moments of quiet reflection were transformative. They didn't erase fear or doubt, but they offered a glimpse of possibility, a life lived in quiet honesty, a life where self-acceptance was slowly, painfully possible. It was around this time, too, that I started to understand the language of identity, not in words spoken aloud, but in emotions, sensations, and small choices. Dressing a doll, choosing a ribbon, holding a fabric just so, these acts were metaphors for living as my true self. Each careful motion, each gentle adjustment, became a meditation in courage. I began to internalize a simple, profound truth. Who I was inside mattered more than who the world expected me to be. And though the journey ahead was long, uncertain, and often lonely, that realization became a seed. It was fragile, yes, but full of quiet, stubborn hope. By the time I reached my early teens, the world outside my room had grown louder, more demanding, and far less forgiving. I could feel the tension between who I wanted to be and who society expected me to be pressing harder against my chest. School had become more complex, a place of subtle judgments, shifting alliances, and the quiet, persistent awareness of being different. I learned to navigate conversations carefully, to laugh when others laughed, to play along with the rough games that didn't interest me, and yet, every evening when I returned home, I felt the relief of slipping back into my sanctuary. My dolls, the ribbons, the delicate fabrics, they were no longer just objects. They had become companions, teachers, and reflections of a self I was only beginning to understand. There were moments of fear that felt nearly unbearable. I remember one afternoon, sitting at my desk, practicing with a new scarf I had borrowed from my sister's collection. My father had come home unexpectedly early. I froze, the scarf clutched in trembling hands, heart hammering against my ribs. He walked by, glanced briefly, and continued into the kitchen without comment. That moment stayed with me, not because of punishment or anger, but because of the silence. It was as if the world had whispered to me, in that small, imperceptible way, that some parts of me could exist, quietly, without confrontation. It was both terrifying and comforting, a paradox I carried forward for years. At the same time, my own self-awareness deepened. I began to understand that what I felt, this attraction to the delicate, the beautiful, the carefully made, was not shameful. It was a reflection of my temperament, my sensitivity, my capacity for care. I started to write more deliberately, chronicling my thoughts, my fears, my discoveries. I sketched outfits, not for dolls alone, but imagining how fabrics might feel against skin, how colors might mirror moods, how small details could convey identity. The journal became more than a diary. It was a lifeline, a map of the inner journey I was only beginning to navigate. Friendships were complicated. Some peers were supportive in ways I could not articulate. drawn to my quiet attentiveness, my patience, my creativity. Others mocked, sometimes cruelly, when my differences became visible in the smallest ways: a choice of scarf, a delicate gesture, a hesitation to conform. Those moments stung, teaching me early lessons about resilience, discretion, and courage. I learned that authenticity often comes with risk, and that living quietly true to oneself requires careful negotiation with the world. Home remained the place where I could explore without judgment. My sister, now a quiet ally, would sometimes leave small surprises: a new ribbon, a set of miniature shoes, a note of encouragement. My mother, in her steady way, allowed me space to create, to dream, to express myself through these small, tender acts. And my father, though never overtly affectionate, began to show subtle signs of understanding: a softening gaze, a silent acknowledgement, a shared moment that carried more weight than any words could convey. The psychological transformation was gradual. I began to feel a quiet pride in my attention to detail, in my care for the things that mattered to me. Each morning, dressing a doll, arranging a ribbon, experimenting with fabrics, I was practicing not just art or play, but self-acceptance. I was learning to inhabit my identity fully, even when the world outside demanded conformity. The journey was emotional, tender, and sometimes lonely, but I began to see that identity is not a single moment or decision. It is the accumulation of countless small acts of courage, reflection, and care. By the end of adolescence, I realized that the boy who had once hidden behind books and whispered stories had grown into someone capable of deep empathy, subtle courage, and profound introspection. The dolls, the ribbons, the scarves, all those small objects, had been guides on a path toward self-discovery, teaching me patience, resilience, and the quiet power of authenticity. And though fear and doubt never fully vanished, I had learned that it is possible to live with them, to move forward, and to embrace the delicate, tender aspects of oneself without shame. Adulthood arrived quietly, without ceremony, and yet it carried with it the weight of all the years I had lived in secret, the accumulation of small fears, small triumphs, and small revelations. I left school, moved to a city where no one knew my past, and for a time, I felt both liberated and untethered. The freedom to reinvent oneself is intoxicating, but it also brings its own anxieties. Who was I now, when the familiar boundaries of family and neighborhood were gone? Would I continue to hide the tender parts of myself, or could I finally allow them to breathe in the open air? I began to build routines that mirrored the quiet rituals of my childhood, but with new layers of meaning. My apartment became a place of careful curation, a space where textures, colors, and objects reflected the inner life I had nurtured in secret for decades. Scarves and ribbons were no longer borrowed or hidden. They were part of my daily attire in subtle, meaningful ways. Dolls had evolved too, not as toys, but as objects of reflection, reminders of patience, of care, of the journey I had undertaken to understand myself. In dressing them, arranging them, and observing them, I was practicing mindfulness, compassion, and self-acceptance. Each movement was both homage and affirmation, a small ceremony of recognition for the person I had become. Relationships became a new frontier. Friendship, intimacy, and love all carried the tension of revelation and acceptance. I learned, slowly, that not everyone would understand, and that was okay. The right people, those who could see beyond convention and expectation, became treasured allies in my life. With them, I could share the stories of my childhood, the long hours of quiet play, the secret rituals that had shaped me. And in sharing, I discovered the liberating power of truth, that vulnerability, far from weakness, builds connection and trust. It was a lesson I had learned only after years of careful navigation, a lesson I carried in every interaction, every word, every gesture. Fear, though quieter now, never fully disappeared. There were moments when I would hesitate, wondering if the world was ready for the full truth of who I was. But the decades of practice, of patient self-observation, of small acts of courage, of quiet reflection, had taught me resilience. I had learned that identity is not a single revelation, but a lifelong negotiation between self and world, a continuous dialogue between what we hide and what we choose to reveal. And in that dialogue, I had finally begun to find peace. I began to reflect on the journey itself, the way a punishment in childhood, intended to correct or discipline, had become the seed of self-discovery. The dolls, the ribbons, the scarves, the quiet rituals, they were never trivial. They were guides, teachers, companions in a transformation that was as psychological and emotional as it was personal. And in that reflection, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the patience of my younger self, who endured fear and doubt. Gratitude for the small acts of kindness from my family, who, knowingly or unknowingly, allowed me the space to grow. Gratitude for the inner courage that had carried me through decades of quiet struggle, teaching me that authenticity, even when fragile and unconventional, is a form of strength. Now, looking back, I see the arc of my life not as a series of deviations or mistakes, but as a tapestry of experience, each thread carefully placed, each knot a lesson in resilience. The transformation I underwent, slow, tender, sometimes painful, was not about the external world recognizing me. It was about recognizing myself. And in that recognition, I discovered a profound, enduring truth that love, acceptance, and courage begin within, and that a life lived in quiet authenticity can be as rich, as meaningful, and as beautiful as any life shaped by convention. Now, in the soft quiet of my later years, I can look back on that boy who once hid behind books and whispered stories with a sense of gentle awe. I see him trembling with fear, clutching a ribbon in a dimly lit room, unsure if the world would ever accept him. I see him learning patience through tiny dolls, discovering courage in the quiet choices that no one else noticed. And I feel a profound tenderness toward that child, because he carried within him the seed of a life that would come to be rich with self-understanding, love, and quiet triumph. I think often about the lessons he taught me, the ones that only time could fully reveal. Patience above all, the patience to wait, to observe, to care. Courage, not the loud kind celebrated in stories of heroism, but the subtle, persistent courage of showing up for yourself each day, of honoring your inner truth even when it feels fragile. And love, deep and enduring, the love of family who offered quiet understanding, the love of friends who saw beyond appearances, and, most importantly, the love of self that had been growing since that first week of punishment in my sister's room. There are times when I still touch the fabrics, the ribbons, the delicate objects that have been with me for decades. Not because I need them to define me, but because they carry memory, continuity, and the soft reassurance that my journey mattered. They remind me that identity is never a fixed point. It is a continuous unfolding, a series of discoveries, fears, small victories, and moments of quiet grace. And I am grateful for every step of that path, for every hesitation, every whispered secret, every act of courage that brought me here. I think about those who might hear my story, who might recognize themselves in it, who have lived in fear or secrecy, unsure if the world, or even they themselves, could ever accept the truth of who they are. To them, I would say this: life is long, and there is time to discover, to grow, to embrace the delicate, tender parts of yourself. Fear is natural, doubt is inevitable, but authenticity, true, patient, tender authenticity is a gift. It is a gift worth guarding, nurturing, and ultimately sharing with the world, even if only in the quietest, subtlest ways. Looking back, I see the full arc of transformation, from a boy hiding behind ribbons and dolls, trembling with fear and curiosity, to a man who has learned to live fully within the embrace of his own identity. And the most beautiful truth I have discovered is this: the journey itself, with all its twists, shadows, and revelations, is what shapes the soul. The journey is the treasure. The courage to honor oneself, the patience to understand oneself, and the love to accept oneself. These are the rewards. So here I am, decades later, reflecting on a life that began with a seemingly small punishment, yet became a profound transformation. And in that reflection, I feel warmth, peace, and a quiet joy that can only come from knowing that you have lived, truly lived, as your authentic self. For those listening, for those remembering their own hidden paths, may you find the same courage, the same patience, and the same love that carried me through all those years. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel